Hi everyone, I'm Alex and welcome back to Community Management 101, where today we talk about what is sentiment, another critical KPI for community and for brand building as a whole in understanding the user's emotions. I tend to find there's often two schools of thoughts here, one of them being a little bit more with the vibes and about the gut feeling and tell me about what the community is feeling and talking about, versus the other end of the spectrum is a little bit more about the data and give me hard data to make data-driven decisions. And I actually argue that these are not mutually exclusive to one another, where you can actually quantify emotions and help with quantified emotions to make data-driven decisions, where you quantify the vibes to help you inform your decision making based on data and quantified emotions. This is actually at the heart of everything that we do at community consulting, and everything that we think about and approach with is this emotional approach to everything. Emotions drive our decision making, they drive our behavior, and being able to quantify emotions and use that as the basis of everything we do, we find is very impactful and helpful. What does sentiment actually measure? When you think about sentiment and emotions in the context of marketing and brand building, it's very much a case of what do people think about my brand? How do they perceive my brand? And how do they feel about my brand? Those are the questions that are very big and important for positioning of a brand to truly understand, is that positioning working? Do we, what we want to achieve with our brand, actually resonate with our users? And is it in their minds of how they see us, how they perceive us, what they think of us, what is their opinions of us? And sentiment and quantified emotions can help us to make an informed decision of where we are at and where we want to go. For the purpose of this presentation, we're once again keeping it very simple. We're making it very simple by only using 3 quantifiers for emotions, the positive, the neutral, and the negative side of things. And this is again a bit of a simplification, especially when it comes to the quantified emotions approach. But this is what we're going to use to help you understand the topic and think about the topic on a more simplified level. It's important to note that the vast majority of conversation online is actually classed as neutral because it's a sharing experience. Sharing information, sharing what is out there with other people is classed as neutral, and that is why there's a good portion of neutrality always present throughout the entirety of the conversation. If I say to you, hey, have a look at this YouTube video or go and read that article, that is a good example for neutral conversation because it doesn't have any indications of if this is a positive or a negative way of sharing the information. If I were to say to you, look at this awesome YouTube video or read that really poorly written article, that's when we can classify these sharing conversations into the positive and the negative, but that doesn't often happen or isn't the case, which is why neutral tends to be the biggest part of the conversation overall. Quantified emotions is then the next level from moving from those 3 quantifiers into the more breadth and wider experience of human emotions. And those 2 can be indexed, identified, and tracked and quantified. But that is the next level, and this is what we're not going to discuss in this presentation. I'm going to use 2 case studies to help you to understand sentiment a little bit more, how to think about sentiment, and ultimately why it matters and why it is important to track these things and think about these things. The first case study, we find ourselves in autumn of 2021, which was the time when NFTs and crypto started to push a little bit more into the mainstream gaming world, and that provoked quite a lot of conversation and controversy even, and this is what we're going to look at first of all. So we have our volume of conversation line here, and now we're going to add the next level of analysis to this, which is the 3 sentiment quantifiers. We have our neutral conversation of conversation contributing and sharing information, we have our negative ones, and we have our positive ones. And this is also the time when you can identify these spikes associated with negativity and with positivity as a weak signal. This is a topic that drives emotions. And when something drives emotion, you can identify it as a weak signal, index it, track it, to see the developments and the trends line around this topic. Because it drives emotions, it therefore has an impact on people's behavior. And this is the point in time when you can already see that this topic drives emotion and therefore should be indexed and followed and be kept an eye on. When we continue looking at the volume evolution of this specific topic, this is what it looked like. And when you remember our momentum presentation, this looks brilliant. There's a lot of spikes, there's a lot of conversation, it's growing, it's quite big driving of a lot of conversation. So this is brilliant. Now with sentiment, we want to look into why this conversation is taking place. We want to understand, is this conversation taking place for all the right reasons or for all the wrong reasons? So what actually happened? So we start off with Valve announcing that Steam bans all games with NFTs or cryptocurrencies on their platform. And you can also see the association with that announcement being driven with positive emotions on the user and the player side. On the next spike, we had EA and their CEO sharing that blockchain and games are part of the future of the industry. And that resulted in the following reaction from the user base, which is a bit more negative, partly driven because of the perception that EA already has, but also because of the nature of the topic that resulted in this. We then had Ubisoft come in with their NFTs and crypto quartz in Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and that resulted in the real negativity spike as gamers saw this being introduced into AAA games, and it was really poorly received at the time. We then had later on Stalker 2 jump in as well and announce their NFTs, followed by a U-turn shortly after, and this is what resulted in the sentiment looking like that. You can see how the U-turn then starkly dropped the negative conversation and actually increased the positive ones, as this was approved by the gaming world, right? We then had Christmas, and over Christmas the conversation always dies because people have other things to do. And in the new year, Team 17 came along and unveils metaverse with NFTs, also followed by U-turn and the subsequent negative spike and followed by the positive spike. And the reason this is important to think about and to understand is if you look at just the volume, this looks like a great thing to do and it should be continuous as such. However, when you take the next level and we also add the sentiment analysis to it and understand why the conversation is happening in the first place and what kind of emotion is being driven by it, we actually look at a very different picture where originally, if you just look at the volume, we would say, this is great, we should do this as well. Versus understanding now that this is actually a negative driver, quite a significant one in this example, maybe we should not, or we need to think about if we wanted to communicate about something in this area, how we can change the perspective, how we need to explain ourselves, and what we need to prepare before the announcement. And this is where sentiment comes in and is incredibly helpful and powerful to have those conversations and to be much better prepared by understanding the driving emotions behind the conversation. The next case study, we find ourselves in autumn of 2018 on Rainbow Six Siege, an Ubisoft title in the first-person shooter genre, and I lived through this time, I worked on this at the time, and we're only going to look at sentiment now. So this is what the sentiment looked like for Rainbow Six Siege at the time, which is a pretty standard one for Rainbow Six and for a first-person shooter genre, because the nature of your game does also dictate what level of negativity you consistently carry in the background, as well as what level of base positivity you can expect. A first-person shooter competitive game naturally carries more negativity than a Just Dance game or a more happy game, simply by the nature of the game. And what we did on Rainbow Six, we published an article announcing our plans of cosmetic changes coming to the game in order to be compliant with the regulations in order to publish a game in China. There's a laundry list of requirements that you have to have in your game in order to be allowed to publish in China. It was newsworthy, as you can see here, and the subsequent reaction of the community looks like this. A huge spike in negativity and basically very little to no positivity. And this lasted for 2 weeks. In technical terms, this is what's called a shitstorm. And the spike in the neutral side up here, you can see this is a BBC News article. It became mainstream newsworthy of the upset of players. You can also see an example here in that asset of what the changes would have looked like. There's requirements where you're not allowed to show skulls and gambling. There's a lot of other requirements in order to be allowed to publish in China. And we were announcing, we haven't done anything yet, that these changes were to come in order to be compliant with China regulation. And this is what the game would look like from today to tomorrow. After 2 weeks, we were then able to announce and share that we have changed our mind, that we will be doing things differently, where we keep the game as is, and we have a separate China build that is compliant with the China regulations. And that, again, was then newsworthy. And this dropped the negativity quite significantly, and the positivity started to come back. It's also interesting to see how the neutral conversation stayed quite high for a while as this news is starting to be shared more broadly and is being disseminated across the internet. It then, however, took another good 2 months, month and a half, thereabouts, to see the negativity and the positivity. He reached a break-even point, and it then kind of eventually started to dip back to the levels that were pretty standard for the game. Now you're going to ask me, so what, Alex? Why do I care about people being upset on the internet? Why does it matter to me? It's just people complaining online, right? And I'd like to show you what happens when I overlay this sentiment analysis with the weekly active user base of this game. I'm not going to share any numbers to respect any confidentiality agreements that might still be in place, especially since the game is still operational, but this is what the weekly active user base for the game looks like. We then announced, followed by this very huge spike in negativity across the entirety of the community, and this is what happened. We lost more than half the user base within the course of 2 weeks. But more interestingly than that, it took us more than 3 months to get them all back. So a direct hit to the weekly active user base, subsequently monthly active user base, of over 4 months is the result of what this announcement did. And that is money. People not being in the game has a direct impact on the bottom line because they are not spending any money, are they? And this is where such analysis can be really impactful when you think about that this sentiment actually has a direct impact on your user base, because your user base is talking to you, in this example, screaming at you. This is rather impactful to understand and to think about that what you do in community management, what you do in sentiment analysis can be directly correlated to monthly and weekly active users. In summary, emotions drive decisions and behavior. This is the core what we do at Community Consulting. This is at the core of what we do. We understand emotions. We want to understand the driving of decisions and the subsequent behavior of the user. And we see this actually as the real power of community management, is to truly understand those emotional drivers, understand the dynamics that are in play, and really know the user. And a community manager in the studio can be so good by spending so much time reading and understanding the user base that they'll be able to predict and anticipate in order to mitigate, manage, or even prevent issues like I've just shown you. This is what we see as the real value of community, is to truly understand the user in that depth and the emotional drivers that make the decision and drive the behavior of the player. And we do that in a quantified way. The quantified way of emotions is what we call it. And if you'd like to learn more of how we do it, what to do it, or have a conversation about this, you should head over to our website at communityconsulting.com, and I will see you the next time.